All right, so we are up to, as I mentioned, Chapter 6. So today is the 7th. And notice here we had the written test already, and we're going to go over Chapter 6. And I've already told you, in my opinion, for whatever that is or is not worth, this is probably the hardest chapter in the book. All right? So we will go over this. My guess is we'll get it done sometime around 10 o'clock. Okay? We'll get a break in there too. And then I will give you the handout. That handout is due on day 12. Today is day 9. All right? And I don't even know if it's, I've got the date on it when it's due. Okay? It's on the handout. So tomorrow on the 8th, we will, actually we're a little bit ahead here, so we're going to do the written test for Chapter 5 tomorrow. On the 8th. All right. And again, the rest of the period tomorrow will be lab. Monday will be a lab. Tuesday will be a lab. Wednesday and Thursday, you've got a fairly complex test that you're taking. Now, I'm thinking we can probably do this in a period, but we'll see. Okay, he's got it over 2 days. I don't know if we'll need 2 days or not, but we'll see when we get to that point. All right. So, like I said, I've got stuff I got to open up here. Okay. All right, so if you're following along in the book, we're on page 247, Chapter 6 on page layouts. So the idea is these are more complex parts of CSS. This is almost 100% a CSS chapter. All right? And again, I've told you this before, but I'm saying it again. Your next test, which will be a week from yesterday, all right, that will be on just Chapter 4 and Chapter 6. But it's expected you know the material in Chapters 2 and 3. But there's nothing specific from Chapter 2 or from Chapter 3. All right. So you'll notice if you look on here, and I'm not going to read them to you, but you'll notice, again, we're going to talk more about the box model. All right. In the last chapter, we talked a little bit about padding. In this chapter, we'll get into margins. One of the most important concepts is float, which we'll talk about in here. We'll also talk about positioning. All right, and the kinds that you'll use most often will be like relative positioning and absolute positioning and fixed positioning. We'll get into those. Then we'll differentiate between doing a 2-column layout, and I think in the next chapter we'll go into a 3-column layout. All right. So the author says here, basically, we have already learned some CSS, but we're adding to it in this chapter. All right. Plus, we'll be introduced in a little bit more depth and breadth of coverage to some of the HTML5 tags. Okay? All right, so you saw this earlier, but this is the box model. As I mentioned to you, I believe it was yesterday, if not the day before, every single thing that you key in, everything that you key in or put on a web page, whether you key it in, put it in as an image or whatever, everything is in a box. That said, it's basically, for lack of better words, it's in an invisible box. But the idea is anything that you put in, you can put padding around. All right? You can put a border around. You can add margin, etc. You can add none of these, any one, any two, or all three of these things that are in here. And as you notice, whether it's padding or border or margin, we talked about this before, top, right, bottom, left. I made the analogy to the old-time analog clock. 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock. All right, so you can set all those. Now, one thing I didn't tell you, for instance, if we do this, if I type in this, padding, 10 pixels. Anybody tell me what do you think that does? It does all of them. So that'll be 10 pixels of padding here, 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 and here. Does that make sense to everyone? All right. Let's suppose that we wanted to actually put it in where we're pretending here that we want 10 up on top here, and we want 5 here, and we want 10 here, and we want 5 there. Everybody with me? We could literally say, padding hyphen top colon 10 pixels and put that in 4 times. It's totally fine to do that. Or we could say padding colon 10 pixels, 5 pixels, 10 pixels, 5 pixels. We could do that. But since these repeat, a shortcut to doing this is to just say that. So if you only put 2 of them in there, the first one will apply to the top and the bottom, and the second will apply to the right and the left. Does that make sense? Those are just shortcuts that somebody decided you were going to have. All right. There's even one where you can put in 3, but I don't remember what it is right now. Maybe that'll be in the chapter. But there are shortcuts. All right. Some people who consider themselves CSS purists put everything in there. So in other words, if they had this, they would still put in padding hyphen top colon 10 pixels, padding hyphen right colon 5 pixels, etc. Because they believe in putting every single thing in. All right. Other people would do it this way because it's less typing. All right. More than anything else, it's a matter of personal preference. But when you start to create really complex websites where you've got all sorts of things in there, and all those different things that you have in there have padding, margin, etc., I'd recommend using shortcuts when you can, because otherwise, if you put all your CSS, for each thing that you're doing on its own line, pretty soon you have 1,000 lines. All right, and it just gets really hard to manage. All right, so the author says here, if we turn up to page 248, the content area is defined as consisting of a combination of text and web page elements. So it can be literally anything that's on a page. All right, typically it's going to be text or it's going to be graphics. All right, but it's basically anything you want. Now notice they've got a couple words here that are bolded. The visible width of an element on a web page is the total of the content, the padding, and the border. All right. However, the width property only configures the width of the content. It doesn't include any of them. But so the idea is, if this was our content and we had 10 pixels of padding here, 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 and here, for example, if this was, as an example, let's just say this was 100 pixels wide, it's really not. If there's 10 pixels here and 10 pixels there, it's 120. Does that make sense to people? Same thing as if the height is 100 and that's 5 and that's 5, then it's really 110. Okay? So the padding, I believe, I don't know if that's either was a question on your test today or that's a question on your test tomorrow. Okay, some of you are shaking today. So again, it's the area between the content and the border. If you don't have, what you'll find when you work on this is if you have some content that's over here and there's nothing else next to it. So maybe you've got an image and it's up here and everything else is down below. Sometimes whether you use content or padding, it's very hard to tell the difference between the two. But if I had my content here, let's just pretend for a second what we see here. We had another one of those right there. All right, so we had 2 of them back to back. All right. Then padding would be, the more we increase the padding, the more this would be. All right, etc. But with margin, it's the thing between the two. All right, so padding is kind of internal to the content area, where margin is kind of external to the content area. All right. So border, as it says, it's the area between the padding and the margin. Margin determines the empty space between an element and adjacent elements. And as they mention on the top of page 249, the author talks about the margin property and says you use it to configure the margins on all sides of an element. I think we talked about this before, but in case I didn't say it, in fact, I'm fairly positive I did, anything that says margin bottom, margin left, margin right, margin top, It works the same way for padding. So you can take out the word margin, put in the word padding if you want to use padding instead. Sometimes what you're going to find is when you are manipulating a web page, you'll want to use both margin and padding. All right? You remember yesterday when I showed you, and I made that real kind of goofy little page where I put the 3 divs on it? Everybody remember that? All right, I think they were green divs. I put them each on a separate line. If you really want to learn margin and padding, do something like that. Create 2 or 3 divs, but put them on the same line. See what I'm saying? Try to put them together. So I don't know how to do that. That's what you're going to learn today. Then start working with margin and padding, and then you can really start to tell the difference between the two. You'll see it again when we get to Chapter 8, which is coming up not next week, but probably the following week. All right? And then we're going to talk about tables. So you're going to see this stuff again. All right. Starting on the bottom of page 249, they talk about the box, model, and action. And that's what they're showing right here. All right. Now you do have the student files, so if you want to, you should be able to get to that. But this does a good job here. All right. This shows you the margin because the margin is here and it's also here. It's the distance between either 2 elements or an element and the top or an element and the right or an element and the left. Does that make sense? All right. Padding, on the other hand, is the distance inside of the element. And I believe the reason they use the border, not only because they're talking about borders, but it really shows. So if I sat there and doubled whatever the padding was, this border would still be there, but it would be up and down, etc. And there'd be more area in here. Okay. So that was my little explanation of it. If you like better what they say in the book here on page 250, it's pretty much the same thing. All right. All right. So the next thing they talk about in here is normal flow on page 250. And it's kind of interesting. What it says is, by default, when you put things on a web page, they go from left to right. Okay? And if this is my web page right here, right there, and I'm going to put, let's just say 3 divs on it. All right? Well, it'll try to put one there, and one there, etc. If it's too wide, so the first one's real wide, then it'll try to do this. If they're both all too wide, it'll do this. Does that make sense? All right, but it goes from left to right. You can change that if you want to. We're going to talk about that in just a matter of moments. But that going from left to right is the normal flow. So they appear on the page in the order in which you put them into your HTML. All right? I mean, if for some reason, I don't know why you'd ever want to do this, but if you transposed and put your header at the bottom and your footer at the top, you could do that. There's nothing that keeps you from doing it. All right? So it says later in the chapter we're going to experiment with CSS positioning and float. So we'll talk about that at that time. So in this chapter, if you look in here, in fact, if we look at the code that is in here for the practice that's on page 251, in the first case, the first one that you see, in fact, let me move that up. Oh, I guess it isn't there, it's here. I guess they don't show the code, of course, in this copy, but you've got it in your book. The key thing to notice is, if you look at this, we have 2 different divs, and there's one div, then there's the other div. Does that make sense? If you look at the second example, the one that's here, you've got a div within a div. You see the difference? That's literally referred to as nesting divs. You can nest, as you go on in your career here, you'll find that there's virtually just about anything that we learn, you can nest. All right? It's not always the case. I don't know if you can really nest an HTML document inside of an HTML document, but you get the idea that most of the stuff we talk about, you can put one within the other one. So that's what they're showing in this second example. So these are 2 different divs. This div is nested within inside of that div. That becomes important too when we start talking about some of the stuff we can do with JavaScript. All right, because then this is referred to, this div is a child of this div. And these two divs right here, don't worry about the size, that doesn't matter. Technically, they're referred to as being siblings. Okay? All right. So that's what they have you do in the practice. I guess they did have the code in here. So that's the practice that's on page 250. All right. Next, on page, I guess it's 251. On page 252, this is probably the most important thing we've learned thus far in the class. All right, because what we're talking about in here is what's referred to as the float property. Okay? When you put things on a web page, they naturally try to go to the left. Okay? But so what happens if I sit there and I've got some text like this, okay, and I want to make sure, let's just assume, for example, I want that to appear way over here as opposed to where it is. Then I can use what's called the float property, okay, and that's what this is about in here. Now notice, it says elements that seem to float to the left or to the right are often configured using the float property, where float right floats it to the right side of the container, float left to the left side. One thing to realize is if you start to, if you put CSS in that says float right, for example, then everything down below it is going to attempt to keep floating to the right. Does that make sense? It's like you turned on right floating. So you've got to turn it off. All right, and to use that, and we'll see it in just a minute, there is something that's called the clear property. And you can clear out floats. So you can clear left, you can clear right, or you can clear both. All right? And again, you're going to see all this as we start getting into it. All right, so it says here, figure 6.5 that you see that here on page 252 shows a web page with an image configured with float right. All right? Now, if we didn't have that, if you didn't have that at all right, what would typically happen is you'd have the image, it would be on the left. Not only would the image be on the left, the text would fall down below it because that's normal flow. All right? So what we're saying is push this way off to the right, and then with our text, just try to fill it into the gap, so to speak. So it says, notice how the image stays to the right-hand side. All right? So how did they do that? Okay, when we look at the image, float right. Now, ideally at least, when you look at the CSS that's in there, okay, ideally when you look at that, you know what all that means. Every single thing that's in there. You know what that's doing for the H1 element. Look at the background color, and you'll notice there it is, the background color. It's got padding, so it's got 5 pixels here, 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 and here. The color, all right, is black, so that's the text color. Our font family says use Arial if you have it, otherwise use sans serif. And for the image, float it to the right. Also have no margin on the top, no margin on the right, 5 pixels on the bottom, 5 pixels on the left. Typically, what's most important here is probably that left margin, the last one, because if we didn't put any margin in there, boom, the text would go right up against the image. Does that make sense? Yes.
There's no margin on the top. Why isn't the image like right next to the
I believe that the reason for that, I could be wrong here, is I think it's because of the padding that they put here, and I think it's because of the actual way that the text is set up. It's going to have some in there because that's a paragraph tag, so a paragraph tag is an inline tag, so it'll automatically put some in there for you. All right. Notice that the HTML, that hasn't really changed. But I do want to mention one thing. I said this the other day, I'm saying it again. Everybody agree here? It says image ID equals YLS. What the author really should have done there is not had this here, and I would have put in here height, :100, semicolon, width, colon, 100, semicolon, and then ended the curly brace. Then we could have gotten rid of this, and then we could have gotten rid of this. The reason that you typically want to do that, and we started talking about this, but not really in much depth or breadth of coverage, is you want to separate out the CSS from the HTML, because then you're separating your content, which is the HTML, from your presentation, which is the CSS. That's the recommended way of doing things. This is not incorrect. This is just considered a better way. So if you say, well, that's fine, I get that, then why didn't she do it that way? I'm not Terry Felk Morris, so I can't tell you why she didn't. All right? Possibly later on in the book, she will start doing that. I don't know. And the other thing to notice is when we do it here, we have to say width equals 100. And up here, we just had to say height 100. In fact, I guess I said it wrong because that really should have been in pixels. So up here, we would have said height 100 pixels and width 100 pixels. All right. Okay, then immediately there's another hands-on practice where you do this. And you come in here and you start working with the stuff that's in here. So notice it says create a folder called ch6 float, copy that file, which you can now get. But notice this, I've had people tell me that they find this confusing. We're floating here, right? But they make the class name float. Okay? Some people find that confusing. When you make names of classes and when you make names for IDs, they should be descriptive names. You are floating here, so it kind of makes sense. What you shouldn't do, and I mentioned this earlier, you may or may not remember, but if I'm going to do this, all right, let's assume that I'm going to make a class that's going to handle errors. And so I want the color to be red, and I want the font weight to be bold. So it's going to be bold and red. Now I could call this, all right, I could call this particular class, I could call it red. There's absolutely nothing that stops me from doing that. The problem is if later on, bless you, we decide we want to change the color, then we really should change this, and you may or may not remember to do that. A better name, if this was going to handle errors, would be to call this error. Does that make sense to everyone? All right. So I will expect that when you create names for your IDs and when you create names for your classes, you will use descriptive names. Of course, if it was for all paragraphs, it would just be P. All right. But do you realize too that if I didn't want all paragraphs to be red, I could give any paragraph I wanted an ID. You can give anything that we've created so far an ID if you want to do so. All right, let's finish up this part of the section and then we'll take a break. All right. So it says here, and this is the bottom of page 253, the floated element and the normal flow. I don't want to read to you, but the author says, take a step back and look at what you've just done. I would strongly suggest that you go through the exercise, the actual practice exercises of this chapter. All right, I think it'll really help you once you take the hands-on test next week. All right. Again, if you say I don't have the time or I don't want, then don't do it. All right. All right. And the last thing I'll tell you before we take a break is if you look starting on page 254, they talk about, and I said this before, clearing a float. So the clear property is used to turn floating off. Okay? Now, if you did a float left, you can do a clear left. If you do a float right, you can do a clear right. Quite often when people want to turn off all floating, you can do this. All right, you can say clear both. Because what that means is both clear left and it means clear right. And you can do a clear both even if you've only floated left or if you've only floated right. Okay? Most of the time, that's what you see is when people set up a class. In fact, a lot of them, for whatever reason, call it ClearFix. All right, I don't know why, but that just has been a name over the years that a lot of developers use. And then you've got clear both. Okay, so it says a common technique to clear a float is to add a line break configured within the clear property. All right, it says here you got clear left, etc. Then they do it with this, and notice that's the line break. That's what they're talking about. So that will turn off floats. Okay, that's one way of doing it. The other way that you see it, actually probably more often than that, than using a line break, is to use a div. So it would just be div class equal clear left div. So it'd be just a div with nothing inside of it. The only reason I put that up there is I think at least you see this much more often than you see this. All right, but either one would work. All right, and lastly, in this section here on page 255, they talk about the overflow property. Have you ever heard the old saying, hey, he tried to stuff 10 pounds worth into a 5-pound bag? You ever heard that saying? That's what we're doing here. So if we have an area on our screen that, let's say, is 100 pixels by 100 pixels. So we've set a certain area up like that. But we have more text or a bigger image than the size that we have allotted for that text or for that image. Then you get what's called overflow. And how you handle overflow is up to you. So notice, overflow is often used to clear a float, but its real intended purpose is to configure how content should display if it's too large for the allocated area. So, the default means if you do nothing, what it does is it just extends it. So if you had a picture that was too big for the area, it just goes out anyway. And if there's text there, you'll be able to see the text, but it'll be behind the image. Does that make sense? So the image will be in the foreground, and the text will basically be in the background. But you should be able to, well, depending on the opacity or whatever, see both. Hidden. The content is clipped to fit the area. So it just says show as much as you can. That's it. Auto, as it says, it fills the area, but if it needs more height, then you get a vertical scroll bar. If it needs more width, you get a horizontal scroll bar. All right? Or you can say scroll, which always puts the scroll bar in there whether it's needed or not. So it's up to you with an overflow to say how you want to handle material that might be too big for the area in which you're putting it. All right? And you might say, I don't even get it. Why would you worry about this? Sometimes what happens is a person lays out a web page, and literally they've got sizes and everything looks great. And then somebody else comes in and says, you know what, I want to make a change to this paragraph. And they end up adding a sentence or two. And now they're actually got a bigger, more content than the area to hold it. That's where overflow comes in. All right? All right. They also mention that you can use this to clear a float as well. All right. You don't see that very often, to be honest with you. So here's what it looks like. Okay. It says we got the overflow property. Well, we did this, and we told it we only wanted it to use that much area. Well, again, we need more width, and we need more height. So it automatically puts the scroll bars in there for us. All right. So on page 256, they talk about how you can configure scroll bars. If you want them in there, I don't think you see this very often. Overflow scroll. More often than not, you'll see overflow auto, which means only provide one or both scroll bars if they're needed. Okay? So that brings us to 2-column page layout. It's 902. Let's come back, please, at about 9:17.